Hello, listeners. Welcome to Tales from the Bridge, Episode 3.
I'm Sam.
I'm Kevin.
I'm Marty.
I'm Tristan. And in this episode, we are talking about Snow Crash by Neal Stephenson. That was Kevin's choice for the book of the month. And stick around to find out what Sam has us reading for the next book. All around, we have a lot of fun, great conversation at the end where we talk about paradoxes and time travel. So, let's make our way over to the bridge. Did you guys not listen to Yes and Rush? That's all your sci-fi prog rock, guys.
Oh man, no! I was listening to Krista Berg and sewing leather pouches and reading fantasy novels when I was in high school.
I was a hippie kid who listened to punk rock music and the Clash and the Jam and the Specials were sort of what I grew up on alongside my dad's like Beatle and Rolling Stone collection. So
Nice.
Nothing really sci-fi related in that. I think more now, like when I think of sci-fi related music, I kind of go to like electronic music, and maybe that's just there's an electronic band that broke up recently and they had the Helmets.
Daft Punk. They definitely had some futuristic, sci-fi themed songs for sure.
Yeah. Well, those helmets, man! The first time I saw that, I was like, "What? What?" And they always do this? Oh my god, that's amazing! Good for them, man.
And The Matrix was one of the first movies to really do electronic music well for the time, and really.
What was before that though was Hackers. The Hackers soundtrack was, in my world, was outstanding. I don't know if anybody remembers that.
Yeah, I totally remember that one.
Do any of you guys subscribe to Apple TV? No. I just heard very recently about this show that's on Apple TV exclusively called For All Mankind. And I'm not sure if anybody's heard of this, but it's the second season has just started. The first season was in 2019, and it's a kind of a revisionist history of the 1960s and the space race, and very much like Red Sun, the comic book we were reading, Red Sun about Superman. The Soviets made it to the moon first, and so this storyline kind of sets up the world stage where Americans are behind, and the Russians see themselves having this stage on the world to be able to say, "Look, we're superior," and so they do things like send women up to the moon. They have a diverse group of people who go up from different ethnic backgrounds, and so it shifts the way people in the world think about being more progressive, and so they provide this alternative for history where Ted Kennedy, the just recently passed senator in the U.S., he becomes president of the United States, and so it sounds like an amazing show. And have any of you guys heard of this show at all?
I've never heard of it, but I'm shocked I haven't. Now that I'm looking at the Wikipedia page, Ronald D. Moore did it, right? So he's of Battlestar Galactica fame and Star Trek and Outlander. Wow.
I know his name.
And Fargo, as I understand it, the director of Fargo is also involved in some way.
Well, this looks great. I'm all over that. That sounds amazing.
Yeah. I mean, it was news to me, which is why I wanted to bring it to your guys' attention. Sam, I saw you nodding your head. Have you heard of it?
I have. I just got a new iPhone. So with that, I got a free 3-month subscription to Apple TV. So I went for it, and I was looking around, and the show jumped out at me. And you've said everything I know about it, so I actually haven't had a chance to read it or watch it yet. And but yeah, it looks amazing. And the thing that jumped out at me was Battlestar Galactica director, and we had just had that conversation about Battlestar Galactica, a little while ago. So it was top of mind. I was like, oh, this looks really good. So yeah, it's on my list of TV to try.
I had a conversation with a friend of mine who works for an aerospace company outside of Niagara Falls, and they have a contract with the Canadian Space Agency, which works with our partners at NASA and European Space Agency, and he works on software that controls Canadarm2 out on International Space Station. And we were talking a little while ago, and he said to me, no, I said to him, oh, I understand they're going to be end of lifing the International Space Station at some point in the near term. And I said, that's kind of sad, isn't it? And he says, oh no, let's burn that thing. Let's get that thing out of the way. And I said, why? Why would you ever do that? We want some type of presence in space, don't we? And he said, yeah, we do. But have you not heard about the Deep Space Gateway, the DSG? And I said, nope, I've not heard of the DSG, the Deep Space Gateway. And as I understand it, this is the replacement for the International Space Station is intended to be another space station that's actually productive. It's more of less of a science type space station, but more of a jumping off point to outside of the Earth-Moon system to the rest of our solar system. And it would be at the L2 Lagrange point, which is the opposite side of the moon, facing away from the Earth. Like if you were to draw a line between Earth up through the moon, it would be at the point where gravity doesn't pull it into the moon, but it also doesn't shoot out into the solar system. It's just kind of stuck there. So it's a nice place where you don't have to use a lot of energy to leave and to stay. Unlike the International Space Station, which requires a lot of lift to keep it in low Earth orbit. And he says, yeah, man. And so I started looking it up, and there are these amazing plans where it would actually orbit around the L2 Lagrange point and come in closer than the moon. And then there's all these opportunities for spacecraft to easily get to this thing, and it could help launch it out to the Lagrange 2 point. So anyway, that was news to me. I did not know about this Deep Space Gateway plan that NASA's doing. And the whole space launch system, the big honking rockets that NASA's been building for a decade or longer, the whole point of that is to be able to build this thing, or to be able to get to the point where they could build something like this. It's not just to go to Mars, it's to be able to do this as an intermediary. I don't know if anybody's heard about any of that stuff.
No, I hadn't heard of it.
Oh, not really.
I mean, I've been chatting with Tristan and Nick a bit, right, about all the SpaceX launches, and I was not aware just what a workhorse like these guys are. Well, they're just building the whole infrastructure, to just keep building these things bigger, more and more. And it's not like the one-offs that we're used to with NASA. Like they're about to launch, I think this week they're going to launch SN11, right? So like SN10 was 2 weeks ago or something like that. So, they've got the infrastructure and they just blow them up, right? And build another one, blow it up, build another one. That's what you got to do to like make rockets. You got to blow some of them up, make the mistakes you got to make and revise it and keep going. So I was just quite blown away with just the pace at which SpaceX is making these giant leaps forward. So
and not just them too, right? We're getting to the point where there's going to be launches every day. Blue Origin they're doing really well.
Well, you got to take risks, right? Like it's an inherently risky business developing space capability, and so yeah, I mean, I was shocked when NASA like shut down the shuttle program and they just like shut down everything. I'm like, yeah, sure, private industry's going to do it. And I was like, that is crazy. Really? I don't know about that. That's a huge risk, but boy, they've really pulled it off, and they've just like leapfrogged ahead of where NASA could have been by now. And yeah, and I realize it's about money, but it's also about like being able to take risks, being able to blow stuff up, right? Like governments can't do that. They're so risk averse that it's just antithetical to the kind of technology you got to develop.
And there's strategy there too, because NASA's not just relinquishing their value add into the space ecosystem. They're shifting it, and I didn't understand it until I started reading up on some of the proposals for this Deep Space Gateway. And so it's not just going to hang out in that L2 Lagrange point on the far side of the moon. It's going to orbit in towards the Earth and always pivot back to the L2, and it's some weird orbit that I can't remember the name of. But what that means is these private companies could launch fairly easily into mid to high Earth orbit, but before the moon, well before the moon, it can intercept with this Deep Space Gateway, dock with it, and it'll be brought out to the L2 Lagrange point where you can start to do assembly of large of large spacecraft. And that, I think, is a role for government, like to create that sort of infrastructure where you've got like basically assembly areas in the L2 Lagrange point, which, and if that happens, then it suddenly becomes much more cost effective.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You got SpaceX, you got Blue Origin, who can get you up there, and then you've got this government infrastructure that can control it in some ways. It's valuable property, so I think somebody wants to stake some claims on that L2 Lagrange point.
Right, right. They said that they weren't making any more real estate, and guess what, pal? There's more out there.
Not much space up in space.
I have to wonder what the kind of designs the Chinese would have on making a bid for that point, right? Like I mean, I don't know the story, but it seems like how many space stations how much infrastructure can you fit in that point, and will there potentially be a race for it?
Right.
Well, Snow Crash?
So Snow Crash was a book that I said kind of in our last session was one that was formative for me when I was young, and I expressed my worry that I thought that it would be dated, and I was right. It's dated, obviously, right? This was intended to be a book talking about a near future where the laws of society have collapsed, and what is humanity going to do in that type of a situation? And this is coming out of a lot of different views of science fiction at the time, like Neuromancer and Blade Runner, that, well, things are going to be crappy. We're going to live in these terrible cities that are crime-ridden, and everybody has to look out for themselves, and only the strong can survive. And which is naive, because people have a tendency to move towards society and helping each other. But in any case, that was the view of Snow Crash, but you know, if we go back to the 90s and we put ourselves in that book, or as a reader reading that book, and I'll just you know, in terms of myself, I can't remember how old, mid-teens probably when I was reading this thing. And here's the protagonist, whose name is Hero Protagonist, who is a hacker and a sword fighter and a really good motorcycle rider, and he's good with the ladies, and everything about this man is unbelievably cool. So for me, it was one of these things that set me off in this direction of thinking about what it is that I want to do with my life. So it was very formative to me. And it's funny now to read it again and to sort of shake my head and say, oh my God, I was kind of young and dumb. And that this storyline is not subtle, not even slightly subtle. It's just, let's bash you over the head around this concept, and let's bash you over the head around this one. Which is exactly what, for me, as a teen, needed, and to keep my interest. That said, I did enjoy it, reading through it again. I don't remember there being such long periods of discussion with the librarian, the computerized librarian, talking about Sumerian history and language and religion. I'm surprised I got through it. I almost wonder if I did a little bit of skipping when I was younger, but I actually found that to be very instructive and very informative. And I wonder how much that's real. Knowing Neal Stephenson, I feel like some of it probably is real, right? At least some of it might be based in some fact.
Stevenson's odd from the two that I've read now of his, where he's very mature and his writing is so good, but he's also very immature. Like there's something there that's it's hard to define.
Well, I think this was a great example of a book, an early book, right? An early successful book, I guess. It was his third book by a writer who grew a lot more. Because I certainly found windows of just like amazing writing and amazing ideas, like gems, but they were really isolated for me, right? Like I felt that the writing actually wasn't great for most of it, but there was occasional glimmers of brilliance with like really good writing where he got the style right and he got the ideas, but it was very underdeveloped, right? Like for me, the most interesting parts were with the librarian. I really liked the neurolinguistic shtick here, but I wanted more. I wanted a lot more, actually. I felt like he didn't really do much with it, right? Like you can imagine this idea in the hands of like I don't know, Dan Brown or some other space opera guy or some, like they would have taken this idea and actually written the scenes. You can imagine all the things you can do with a neurolinguistic virus, right? Like he should have been having slave armies and like a guy that did this and made a guy do that. And like he really just sort of dropped the ideas on you. And then he just went on with this other story. And there was a whole bunch of this other story. Like, it was a little much, right, for me. It was heavy on style and a little light on substance. Even though the substance when it came was like great, I just wanted more.
Yeah, I thought it was fun. I think coming off of Neverness, it was a kind of a fun break, and dude's got samurai swords, cool name, and a motorcycle. Let's go for it. Like, I was kind of up for it, and I enjoyed it for that until it got to this, this Sumerian neurolinguistic virus, and I was like, oh, I really do enjoy this piece, and that sort of history and this sort of idea of obviously a kind of reimagining of history, or adding a sci-fi spin to ancient history. I thought it's like that's a good hook for me. So that's really where I came on as well, and where I was kind of ready to forgive the samurai swords and the weird world that he had sort of created to begin with. I was pretty sympathetic. I was picturing it as it was written in 1999, right? So this is 92.
I think so. Yeah.
So
Yeah, right.
we had dial-up, right? Like if that,
Right.
and
Yeah.
so this sort of, in a way, the imagining of this dystopian world is a little bit out there, but the metaverse, pretty ahead of its time in a lot of ways, right? Like, the idea of hacking and computer viruses, again, like if it's 90, I thought it would be kind of ahead of its time for 99, much less 92. So I had fun with it, and when it got to this sort of, I like a kind of historical fiction anyways, or a what if type history stuff. So that kind of went right into my wheelhouse.
Here, I highlighted a piece I wanted to read. The people of America, who live in the world's most surprising and terrible country, take comfort in that motto. Follow the low glow outward, and where the growth is enfolded into the valleys and the canyons, you find the land of refugees. They have fled from the true America, the America of atomic bombs, scalpings, hip-hop, chaos theory, cement overshoes, snake handlers, spree killers, spacewalks, buffalo jumps, drive-bys, cruise missiles, Sherman's march, gridlock, motorcycle gangs, and bungee jumping. They have parallel parked their bimbo boxes in identical computer-designed burb clave street patterns and secreted themselves in symmetrical sheetrock shitholes with vinyl floors and ill-fitting woodwork and no sidewalks. Vast house farms out in the low-glow wilderness, a culture medium for a medium culture. That is a great piece of writing and totally bang on, right?
It is.
Yeah, that's
Yep.
where we're at. The raft was very interesting. It was almost like the ushers at a church, in a way, where you had these people who were standing around waiting to usher you in a certain direction or monitor you for your behavior on the raft.
Well, it was also interesting that he had the raft, and the guy was named L. Bob Rife,
Right.
right? And
Yeah.
and see, he was starting this concocted religion, and
Well, you're thinking of L. Ron Hubbard. It's right. It's clearly an allusion to L. Ron Hubbard. It's Bob L. Rife, right? But it's
Yeah,
L.
yeah,
Ron Hubbard,
exactly.
and so I
Yeah,
think
L. Ron
he's
Hubbard.
talking about Scientology to some degree there.
It's quite possible. I was wondering about that. Yeah. And that's very much what he was trying to do with this,
Yeah.
is make that commentary. That's come out in other books too. In Fall or A Dodge in Hell, that book, the first section of that one was this taken to the next level. What happens when you have this divided America, and one of that divided America is rational critical thinking, and the other half is not, and they sit in front of their, modern day equivalent of the boob tube, which is some type of curated stream that only gives you a bubbled view of the world. What happens when that's brought to extremism, and you have little island nations within the United States, and to the point where if you have to drive through parts of Missouri, you get armed escorts up in front and behind until you get into the next county, and then things are fine. So yeah, he really likes to play with this idea, and he's very critical of American society.
Very much so, yeah.
I want to read one more passage here then. All these beefy Caucasians with guns, get enough of them together, looking for the America they always believed they'd grow up in, and they glom together like overcooked rice, form integral, starchy little units. With their power tools, portable generators, weapons, four-wheel drive vehicles, and personal computers, they're like beavers hyped up on crystal meth. Manic engineers without a blueprint, chewing through the wilderness, building things and abandoning them, altering the flow of mighty rivers and then moving on because the place ain't what it used to be. The byproduct of this lifestyle is polluted rivers, greenhouse effects, spouse abuse, televangelists, and serial killers. But as long as you have that four-wheel drive vehicle and can keep driving north, you can sustain it. Keep moving just quickly enough to stay one step ahead of your own waste stream. In 20 years, 10 million white people will converge on the North Pole and park their bagos there. The low-grade waste heat of their thermodynamically intense lifestyle will turn the crystalline ice scape pliable and treacherous. It will melt a hole through the polar ice cap, and all that metal will sink to the bottom, sucking the biomass down with it.
He paints a pretty picture, doesn't he?
He really does, yeah.
Well, that reminds
the
me
MAGA
of
crowd in a phrase, isn't it?
Yeah. Right? Actually, it was interesting. I read a review somewhere that suggested that not only was this a satire about America and all that stuff, it was actually a satire of cyberpunk itself, right? That I guess that would be the best light in which I could see this, right? That it was sort of meant to be making fun not only of America and all that, but of sci-fi and of cyberpunk, right, and of itself, right, of the book, it actually, as it is, right, like if you name the hero protagonist, then that's the road you're on, right? Like you gotta be basically making
That's true.
And that was also an
excellent point. Yeah,
it was, and that was kind of a sign of the times too, is where nothing is sacred, right? I personally remember a time there where there was nothing that you shouldn't criticize, and this is beyond critical thinking. This is just there's nothing you shouldn't bash, and so there was the idea that this is a caricature. Everything was you're right. Everything was a caricature. It was a caricature of the burbclaves, of the franchises, of the U.S. government, of the mafia, of the hacker culture. It was, let's take those caricatures and let's ratchet them up to 11, right? Let's just take that and move it beyond. Maybe if it's at a 4 today, what could it be if it's all these caricatures are up at 11? That cool skater chick. What would happen if you take the cool skater chick and you ratchet her up to 11? Well, you get YT, and you get her pooning cars and having this uber cool skateboard and weapons on her skateboard, right? You're right. I think that's a good way to put it. It's a satire of cyberpunk culture, and it's a satire of everything.
Though it must be mentioned, and again, like I think for the 90s, he was very forward thinking, and now it seems dated. Especially with the advent of with books like Ready Player One and Ready Player Two, right? And there's been so much written, and the technology has actually existed and been developed that it's sort of lacking. It's naive in its assumptions about virtual reality, right? That just a pair of goggles will do it, and you can put on the goggles while you're driving down the. There was some scene where he's in the van driving down the highway, and he's or maybe he wasn't driving. I don't know, but he was in the van, right? But there's more to it, right? It's more complicated. And Ready Player One really sort of showed, oh, well, you need a tactile element. You need to move your body. You need to, there's more sensory input that's necessary to make virtual reality real. And ultimately, the only way to really make it real is to jack into the brain and actually, feed the signals. It's the Matrix is the ultimate, sort of resolution of this thing. But it was early times, right? That putting on a pair of goggles made you just go right there and experience everything in the metaverse. Like, what's his body doing exactly? And
Yeah.
are his hands up, or is he doing something with his hands? Like, how's he controlling this motorcycle?
Hmm.
How's he controlling anything? How's he moving around? Is it
It's,
all
it's
eyeball motions, or like?
Yeah, he got really deep into parts in the metaverse. So in terms of the physics and how it would work in there,
Mm-hmm,
like if you hit poles, but you could go through other avatars, he got very deep into that. And that was neat because that was forward thinking because people hadn't really thought about that too much. So his envisioning of the metaverse was at the time unique and forward thinking. But then, yeah, like when he was doing his fighting with the katanas,
mm-hmm,
you're exactly right. There wasn't any real discussion about how that would work.
mm-hmm,
Hmm. You could almost think of that as a gap that the Matrix filled in for him. It had just had that feel of like you meet someone in the Matrix and they're like, you cannot pass,
mm-hmm,
and you have to fight them to pass, almost like a video game. But that makes me think that would we have the same version of the Matrix without Snow Crash?
It was definitely a stepping stone in our kind of collective zeitgeist of what would be a 3D virtual world for
yeah,
sure.
yeah.
Hmm.
And when I think of like in terms of iconic books, like I think Neal Stephenson is absolutely a essential and iconic author of our time. But if I was to think, what book would I recommend? If I was going to recommend one Neal Stephenson book for somebody else to read, I could never recommend Cryptonomicon or even Seven Eves. Like he's just so voluminous, and it's such a project to take on one of his books that this is kind of the default. This is what you point to, right? Even though it's dated, even though it's old, even though it's really his first successful novel, it's kind of quintessential Neal Stephenson, even with all its flaws and everything.
Well, it makes me think of movies that are well written and movies that just have good scenes. And
Hmm.
Stevenson is he doesn't necessarily need a full story. That's not his approach. He wants good scenes. He wants good
Right. Yeah.
chapters.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
wants good stuff in between. I would compare Mad Max to a movie like Dumb and Dumber when it comes to the actual plot. In Dumb and Dumber, they're just trying to deliver a suitcase,
Yeah. Yeah.
but the scenes carry that film. In
Right.
Mad Max, same thing. They're just trying to get away. The scenes totally hold that film. And
Mhm.
Stevenson, it's like that.
Exactly.
It's there's not there's not a typical arcing story,
Right.
and yeah, you're not being pulled to the end. It's every chapter or even paragraph. It's the entertainment of his very blunt, rigid writing style that pulls you along. Just the
Mm.
in your face kind of, this is how it is, you better believe it,
Yeah.
kind of style, which a lot of authors want to say, this is how it is, and let me explain that to you. He just says, this is how it is, deal with it, move on.
Mhm.
He's very arrogant in that
Yeah.
way, and it's likable. It's fine. I really appreciate that about his writing.
Mhm.
I really like that idea that he writes the scenes and that he's building those little desperate scenes. It's kind of like what you said, Marty, that there's a lot of style but not a lot of substance. I feel like those are kind of aligned. He wanted a lot of style in this scene, and that was his real priority.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I definitely agree with that.
Did you guys know that Snow Crash is being worked into an HBO series?
I did not
Ooh,
know
Yeah,
that.
cool.
yeah. So there's not much news on it in the last little
Time
while.
has come.
There's yeah, there's a few articles you'll find from 2019, and I see the latest uh, being May last year, 2020.
That's great.
Well, this is exciting. I always look forward to this part.
Drum
Me
it's
roll,
always,
too.
yeah,
please.
drum roll.
Du-du-du.
All right. Well, it's my month, so I have did a little bit of searching around on this one and arrived at a book called A Memory Called Empire.
Oh, hey, great. Okay, great.
So this is by Arcady Martine, which is a pen name
Oh,
for the author. Her real name is Anna Linden Weller, and she's an American historian and city planner by trade. And she received the Hugo in 2020 for the best novel for this book. So she was born in 1985. The book follows a newly minted ambassador, Mahit Desmar, from a still independent mining station on the edge of Texalani space. And Texalani is an empire written in the sort of Roman Empire kind of imperial idea. And she's been called to replace her predecessor who has died under mysterious circumstances. And now she must discover who is behind the murder, rescue herself, and save her station from Texalan expansion, all while navigating an alien culture. So I've started the book. I'm about a couple chapters in, and it's I'm enjoying it so far. They've already got some. She's already got some kind of cool ideas on technology, and that feels new. And so yeah, that's where we're going for this month.
Cool.
Awesome.
And
Well,
you,
that's great. I've read this one.
You
I
have,
think we've
okay.
talked about this already before. Yeah, it certainly. She reminds me a lot of Anne Leckie. We were talking about this, right? So this is right up your alley. Arcadi Martin. I didn't know that was her pen name, but it's I liked it better than. I mean, I really liked Anne Leckie, but this was like that style of writing, only even more, and it's extremely literary, as we've been talking. Like the poetry is strong in this one, right? Like it's actually like part of the book, part of the culture. Is sort of poetry and literature, and that's really nice to dive into. Yeah.
And it's
Awesome.
it's a first book in a series, right? So there'll be more.
I hope so.
Yeah, and this seems to be my habit of recommending like the first book in a really awesome series and then
Yep.
moving on. So
I love that.
I am
That's great.
super excited about the second one. Like this book, it's great. It's not a thriller though, right? It doesn't like pull you through it, but it's great. I really enjoyed it, but it really goes off near the end. Like the sort of climax of this book was one of my favorites of the last couple years of reading. Like it really, I didn't see it coming. I should have maybe seen it coming. I was just sort of blown away by like, wow, okay, great. And then she just really sets you up for the next book. Like this is an introduction where it's all good, it's interesting, you're learning about this empire, the world that you're in, but you haven't met any aliens yet. And like she really sets you up with the second book, and you're like, oh, okay, now we're gonna get the spaceships and the aliens and the battles and all the other stuff. So I'm really looking forward to the second book. Maybe it'll come out and I'll read that while you guys are reading this one.
Very
You
cool.
And you can't go wrong with any Hugo Award, and it's a 2020 Hugo Award winner. You can't go wrong with that. I'm looking, yeah.
Yep. I really have learned this. Like, the Hugo is much more reliable than the Nebula. I've been really disappointed by a lot of Nebula winners that I've read, but I'm rarely disappointed by Hugos. It's kind of interesting that they're so different.
you guys are pretty unstoppable in terms of trivia. Well, we were talking about time travel earlier, and so on the vein of time travel, in looking around, there's 5 common time travel paradoxes found in sci-fi literature. Name 3 of the 5, or all 5, for bonus points with no reward.
Do they have to be named correctly? Like, is there a name for these paradoxes?
You can describe it, and then I'll see if that matches the name, but I think extra unrewarded points for those who can come up with the name.
Well, there's the grandfather paradox. I'm sure that's on there.
Correct.
You go back and kill your grandfather, and then you don't exist anymore, and so what happens? So that's the one I know, but I'm sure that's the one everyone knows.
That was the one I was thinking of. Well, it isn't any of these paradoxes has to relate to going to the past that changes the past in such a way that the traveling to the past doesn't occur, right? It doesn't have to be just killing your grandfather. It could be changing motivations of people in the future that they choose not to go back into the past.
Mm-hmm. Or changing technology, right? That
Right.
doesn't get developed to be able to go back to the past.
Mm-hmm. all of this is predicated on a singular timeline, which is a really big assumption too, right? That if we go back, we change the past, it's going to change our future. That there's not multiple time streams, and you know. But of course, I guess that's what we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm. I guess there's the meeting yourself. Is that sort of one? Meeting yourself in the past has to be.
Well, it's
something.
mentioned within the within a couple of them,
Okay.
but
I don't know.
Let's say there's the 5 common have sort of been labeled are the predestination paradox, the bootstrap paradox, grandfather, let's kill Hitler paradox, and Polchinski's paradox.
Oh, wow.
So the predestination paradox, a predestination paradox occurs when the actions of a person traveling back in time becomes part of past events and may ultimately cause the event he is trying to prevent to take place. This results in a temporal in which event 1 in the past influences event 2 in the future, time travel to the past, which then causes event 1 to occur with the circular loop of events, ensuring that history is not altered by the time traveler, and that any attempts to stop something from happening in the past will simply lead to the cause itself instead of stopping it. And this paradox suggests that things are always destined to turn out the same way, and that whatever has happened must happen. And so they kind of go into cinema treatments here from where I'm pulling this from. This is partly from a astronomy trek.com causality
loop,
and a bit of NPR looped in with this as well. And
that one's
so
really kind of an anti-paradox.
it's
not a
yeah,
paradox.
it's
actually the non-paradox version of what happens.
You're right, yeah, and it's not commonly used. So the only cinema treatment is in the Time Machine, the 2002 movie version, is sort of where they link this one to also The Time Traveler's Wife, Predestination, and 12 Monkeys. Sort of falls within this realm of paradox according to this article.
It was Anne Connolly who did it with All Clear and Blackout. I think
Willis.
Connie Willis, thank you. I believe, at least I read All Clear, and I think in that one that occurred where you couldn't actually change the future, but you could get to the point where you start to disrupt the timeline or something, or you screw up your own reality.
There's one of Ted Chiang's stories in Exhalation, I think it is, The Alchemist and the Merchant's Gate. The first story in that compilation is very much along this line, right? Where you everything has to be self-consistent and nothing changes, but you still learn something through the story, right? That people are emotionally changed by their experience of going back to the past, and but physically everything has to remain consistent. I guess we could put Tenet in that line as well, right? The movie Tenet. I mean, that was extra super bizarre, but only one thing happens. That's the moral of the story, right? There is no paradox. Everything has to fit together in the way that it actually happened, and that's that.
So moving on to the bootstrap paradox. A bootstrap paradox is a type of paradox in which an object, person, or piece of information is sent back in time and results in an infinite loop where the object has no discernible origin and exists without ever being created. And it is also known as an ontological paradox, as ontology is a branch of philosophy concerned with the nature of being or existence. And for cheap movie examples, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, the Terminator movies sort of hit upon this, and Somewhere in Time, if we want to go back to 1980. And then Marty, you got the grandfather paradox. So Marty, you win. Obviously, you win the trivia for this week. I think is fair to say. So and Kevin thought it. So like half points for Kevin on this one. And so the grandfather paradox concerns self-inconsistent solutions to a timeline's history caused by traveling back in time. For example, if you traveled back to the past, killed your grandfather, you would never have been born. It would not have been able to travel to the past in the first place. Thus, paradox. And let's say you did decide to kill your grandfather because he created a dynasty that ruined the world. You figure if you knocked him off before he meets your grandmother, then the whole family line, including you, will vanish and the world would be a better place. According to theoretical physicists, the situation could play out as follows. And there's sort of a timeline protection hypothesis. You pop back in time, walk up to him, point a revolver at his head, pull the trigger, but the gun fails to fire. The bullets in the chamber have dents in the firing caps or whatever, and you point the gun somewhere else and pull the trigger and bang. Point at your grandfather, click, nothing happens. So you try another method to kill him, but that only leads to scars that later in life he attributed to the world's worst mugger. You can do many things as long as they are not fatal until you are chased off by a policeman. Anyway, so it's sort of Back to the Future would be sort of fall within the sort of grandfather paradox. All three Back to the Futures fall under their sort of movie versions of this. And then the let's kill Hitler paradox, similar to the grandfather paradox, paradoxically prevents your own birth. The killing Hitler paradox erases your own reason for going back in time to kill him. Furthermore, while killing Grandpa might have a limited butterfly effect, killing Hitler would have far-reaching consequences for everyone in the world, even if only for the fact that you studied him in school. The paradox itself arises from the idea that if you were successful, then there would be no reason to time travel in the first place. If you killed Hitler, then none of his actions would trickle down through history and cause you to want to make the attempt. And it sort of speaks to the short story, Marty, you were talking about time travel, where people are changing time and not realizing it, so it speaks a little bit to that. And so the book, I love that the book example for this is let's kill Hitler paradox. And so it's its own self-realizing paradox theory here. And then finally, Polchinski's paradox. And this is the one in which there was an interesting article that said this is kind of a potential scenario that seems a little more popular. American theoretical physicist Joseph Polchinski proposed a time paradox scenario in which a billiard ball enters a wormhole and emerges out the other end in the past just in time to collide with its younger version and stop it from going into the wormhole in the first place. This paradox is taken fairly seriously by physicists, as there is nothing in Einstein's general relativity to rule out the possibility of time travel. Closed time-like curves, or CTCs, or tunnels through space-time. Furthermore, it has the advantage of being based upon the laws of motion without having to refer to the indeterministic concept of free will, and so presents a better research method for scientists to think about the paradox. So that was a kind of interesting one, and there have been no movies based on it.
That is the best paradox.
Maybe it's the single sort of point of legitimacy is the fact that it has not made it into anything outside of academia at this point.
It's true, because you take the whole idea of motivation right out of the equation, and it becomes many fewer variables to kind of contend with.
But it is similar to the grandfather as well.
It is.
Where it's, how would it know to move itself out if it hadn't gone through to move itself out, because it hadn't gone through to move itself out.
Yeah. Well, there is this, because it's from the realm of physics, connects to some sort of real possibilities. Like, if you could make anything travel faster than light, then you could basically make something leave or arrive before it leaves from a certain reference frame, right? And then how would that work? How do you arrive somewhere before leaving from where you started? And I guess that's exactly this ball, right? That the ball itself arrives to hit itself before it leaves to arrive in the first place, and hence the paradox.
But then it would only happen once. It couldn't happen more than that, correct?
Well, I don't know if anything would happen. I guess that's that's why it's a paradox. It never makes sense. It couldn't happen.
Well, there was a paper recently that came out of the University of Queensland that proposed a paradox-free time travel as being theoretically possible. And so from researchers at the University of Queensland, even if time travel were possible, the paradox couldn't actually exist, researchers ran the numbers and determined that even if you made a change in the past, the timeline would essentially self-correct, ensuring that whatever happened to send you back in time would still happen. So say you traveled back in time to an attempt to stop COVID-19's patient zero from being exposed to the virus. However, if you stop that individual from becoming infected, that would eliminate the motivation for you to go back and stop the pandemic in the first place. And this is a paradox and inconsistency that often leads people to think that time travel cannot occur in our universe. No matter what you did, salient events would just recalibrate around you. Mm-hmm. Time doesn't want to be changed. It would just adapt to what's happened. And so
if you killed Hitler, it would just be a different guy that ended up being Hitler, right?
But I think it's just, you would never have the opportunity to be able to do that in the first place. And that's why I think we can only travel into the future and never the past. We can only go really fast. We can't go so fast that we go backwards. We can only go so fast that we make one point seem like it went faster.
Yeah, that's my current understanding, that there really isn't. I mean, you really need a wormhole to go back in time, and it's not clear that wormholes actually exist or could exist or anything. Right? We don't really know what happens inside a black hole. It's just all bets are off. So it's not really likely that you could actually bend space-time in such a way to loop on itself so you don't, arrive somewhere. And yeah, you can never travel actually backwards. You can just travel fast enough that, like, the rate at which time flows is different for two observers, but it's always still moving forward, right? Nobody can ever actually turn around and go backwards. One thing I think is really interesting about time travel that has been missed in a lot of the sci-fi literature is that if ever a time machine was built to go back in the past, it would be like a telephone. You need a receiver. You have to build the receiver and the transmitter. Mm-hmm. And so you could never go back into the abstract past. You could only ever go back to the first moment of the creation of the first time machine, which means that if ever a time machine was created, that first moment would be extremely populated, right? Like all future possibilities, every single time traveler for all of the future history would have the opportunity to go back to that moment and probably check that moment out, right? And so you have this notion of a time where if ever a time machine was created, suddenly it would start spewing people, right? Like people would just start showing up. You've created a receiver.
That's a cool concept
for all of the future, and it's the first receiver, and so you'd get a lot of people, showing up, and it'd just be chaos.
It sounds like you've come up with the your first short story there. I want to read that.
Yeah. I would check that out as well. Someone write this story. Okay, we are reading A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martine. That will be episode 5, but our next episode, number 4, is specifically about television and film in sci-fi. There's a lot to talk about. We're going to do this every once in a while. Check it out. Until next time.